Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L coming in with a special anime type review video. This time specifically we're reviewing a concept from Faraway Paladin. This video will be covering some content that came out from between episode 1 to episode 4. And I also checked a little bit of the manga just to kind of help my thoughts along. But yeah, this video is going to be reviewing Faraway Paladin and analyzing the divine and cosmological components of their world and talking about the choices that the author made when creating their world. I will be mostly sourcing episode 4, and I will not be looking at what the manga or light novel has written about it. I will just be reviewing based on the information that the anime has given, and maybe, just maybe, to help a few points I might reference something from the manga, but with what the anime has given us, there's enough here to really just talk about some cool things. So, quick recap in these episodes. In the background of the first 4 episodes of Faraway Paladin, there is some stuff going on about the gods. And in episode 4, we come face to face with Stagnate, the god of stagnation and undeath. He is an evil god, but he was once a good god. And one thing you learn about the character as you see him is that he really just doesn't like the idea of death and what death ultimately represents. Now, I found this entire thing interesting because there are some cool little wrinkles that are going into creating this particular situation. Just to be clear, what makes the situation that Faraway Paladin presents interesting is that you have gods, you have death, you have the fear of death, you have a god disliking death, and you have reincarnation. Those elements all together end up making a pretty interesting picture, and there are a few things that have to be set in order to make this entire thing work. And that's where the interesting choices start to appear. So as we go into this, for reference, I will be referring to theories of reincarnation that come from Tibetan Buddhism, Gnosticism, and Hermeticism. Those are the ones that I am more aware of. If there are other systems of reincarnation, I'm not aware of them. We will be using the general philosophies from these systems, though, to evaluate the philosophy that is being presented to us in Faraway Paladin. So one thing I think you'll take away from this video is that you'll have an idea and an appreciation for just how weak the gods in Faraway Paladin are, and why it is that it's important for the gods in Faraway Paladin to be weak. If the gods in Faraway Paladin were actually strong to the degree that the real world philosophies on reincarnation require them to be, the story of Faraway Paladin might look a little bit sillier, or at least like the fundamental motivations of a god like Stagnate might look a little bit sillier. So I think the best place to start here is really with how the goddess Gracefield refers to death. The despair of death. Now this by itself is the most critical thing, because it's actually incredibly strange to attribute death with despair in the context of reincarnation. To say that there is despair within death, well, that's a perspective that only comes about with an incomplete knowledge of what death means to reincarnation and that particular cycle. And also, to be fair to other religious systems that don't incorporate reincarnation, for them too, death is seen as another stage. Now mind you, there might be a few more things going on here, but it all really depends on how much a god like Gracefield knows, and we'll cover that in a little bit. But it's from here that everything unravels. And it leads us to the big question of what is the point of Faraway Paladin's reincarnation system, because we know the reincarnation system exists. So let's start breaking this down. The reason that death would not be seen as something that causes despair when you are looking at the context of reincarnation has to do entirely with the point of reincarnation. The point of reincarnation, according to the philosophies that we have in our world, are ultimately to learn. It's to get to a place where you weren't before. It's to ascend to higher heights. Where you have a situation where God is infinite, the point of reincarnation is to become infinite by experiencing infinity. And that just ties into the idea that through reincarnation, you are able to ascend to a higher plane of existence. You're able to reach enlightenment. You're able to exit the wheel of karma. Point is, reincarnation fundamentally is a system by which you improve on yourself by multiple iterative processes. For the philosophies that have reincarnation, death is ultimately just another expression of existence. Think of water and think of a block of ice. Death and life are just that. It's pretty much death could be the water and life could be the ice, or vice versa. It's just a natural process, and because reincarnation is about a soul coming back multiple times, it pretty much becomes the divine equivalent of going to sleep and waking up again. We can go a step further and dive back into Faraway Paladin. In the context of Faraway Paladin, We know that reincarnation is a thing, and the characters know that reincarnation is a thing. So when you know that the soul continues to live even after death, why exactly do we have a problem with people dying? I mean, all that's really leaving is perhaps the physical body and the memories, but the soul that underlies it all is still there. But that in of itself takes us into now more conversations about the nature of the gods and what exactly are their limits. When you look at Stagnate, it is very interesting that even though this god would know that reincarnation is a thing and that some form of a person always exists, Stagnate is only looking at what's going on the physical plane. Gracefield too, the fact that she's calling death something that brings despair, it implies that she's very limited. Now the reason that I say limited when it comes to Gracefield is that Gracefield may legitimately know more. I mean, this is a lady that stands below multiple planets. It looks like she has a good view of the rest of the universe. With Gracefield, it's a little bit difficult to draw any conclusions, but thankfully we have Stagnate. Everything that Stagnate says points us to the conclusion that at the very least, Stagnate does not know of any higher purpose or calling that a soul could strive for after death. If a soul truly could reach some enlightenment or go on to ascend to a higher plane of existence, there is no reason to believe that Stagnate would be as hurt as he is about the situation when it comes to death. Because ultimately, what you understand when you see the way this man talks, he values the experiences that souls have when they are incarnated. His perspective is one of a person who is hurt that when someone dies and they reincarnate, they come back and they don't have the memories. The person that person once was is effectively dead even though the soul continued. Now mind you, in reincarnation, usually the idea is that those memories do ultimately go with the soul. It's just they're locked up and they might inform predispositions. Ultimately, when you die, you have all your memories back again. That's the general idea when it comes to this kind of thing. But this again points to the conclusion that as far as Stagnate is aware, this isn't how it works. And if it is how it works, then Stagnate is not aware of that aspect of his universe, which is where the limitation comes in. When you look at Stagnate, it's incredibly clear. He presents a very human perspective on the topic of death, but that is inherently what limits him. He is a god speaking from the perspective of a human. Even though he is a god, he is still at the mercy of the despair that death brings. So when you look at the gods, what you really start to understand is that they are not all powerful. They come in from a perspective of scarcity, or they come in with a perspective of weakness. So here we are, we're talking about a god with very human qualities. We're talking about gods with weaknesses. Is it reasonable to have a god who has these very human pains and who might possibly not be aware of the system that he lives in? Is that possible? Does that make sense? Well, yeah, no, it totally does. All you have to do is say that this god is not at the top of the dog pile. All you have to do is bring in the idea of hierarchy. Hierarchy within deific systems is very common. Heck, even in Faraway Paladin, we know there is a hierarchy. I believe in the first episode, they even mentioned the principal god and the gods that came after him in terms of the origin story of the universe. Having that hierarchy was actually a really good move, because when you have some idea of hierarchy, then the thought that one god is greater than the other, in other words, one god might know something more than another, makes a lot more sense. There's no reason to believe that the gods are created equal, given that there was one god before the others. So when we come to the question, is it reasonable to suggest that Stagnate might be unaware of certain aspects of his universe? Yeah, it is totally reasonable. But I want you to keep this in mind. We actually don't know whether or not the Faraway Paladin universe actually has ascension at the end of the road of reincarnation. And what that is to say is that really, this entire conversation, the reason we're having it is because there is one question that we have not answered. That is, what actually is the point of reincarnation within Faraway Paladin? If Faraway Paladin doesn't have a reincarnation system that ends in a soul ascending to a higher plane of existence, then the limitations that the gods have actually makes a lot of sense. There is one little hint to what reincarnation the purpose of it might be in Faraway Paladin. Actually, there's two hints. One hint comes from what Gracefield says about a soul in motion, and the other hint comes from Stagnate's name. In Faraway Paladin, it seems like reincarnation doesn't really have a purpose other than to keep the universe moving. When you consider that, and you consider what Stagnate wants, a world that never changes, now you actually start hitting something pretty interesting, because when it comes to real-world reincarnation theory, if you could say that it had an enemy, the enemy of reincarnation would actually be stagnation. So it's interesting in that Stagnate is a god of undeath, but he ultimately, his negative quality that the author gave him is more about things not changing, things not growing. I think the author ultimately gave him that particular quality, added in that extra layer of no progression in order to really solidify that this was a negative pursuit that this god had engaged in. Because really, vilifying not wanting to die doesn't really work within the confines of reincarnation, because reincarnation ultimately gets you to a point where you don't have to die anymore. And of course, there are layers upon layers of nuance. There is most definitely a, how would I say it? A not advised way of seeking immortality. Like, please do not go around slaughtering another country's army. And also, speaking of nuance, there is more to that as well, because there is the idea that even though you might start a journey from a very terrible place, the journey itself is what purifies you, such that by the time you get to the end of the journey, you may have learned the lessons that make you a really great person. But of course, this video is not about the many nuances. This video is about Faraway Paladin. So let's get back to that. There's no way around it. The gods in Faraway Paladin fundamentally have to be weak. They have to be lower in the rung, because otherwise the things that they're saying doesn't make sense. Stagnate having a problem with the lack of permanence in the physical world doesn't make sense unless he doesn't understand the purpose of reincarnation, and he doesn't value the fact that the souls are still existing. Overall, it's pretty cool to see how this has to work out. Really, Stagnate and his issue with the impermanence of the physical world is very interesting, and I would really love to see the character just talk about what he understands of reincarnation, and just see how much does the character actually value a soul. Does the character have an issue with souls losing their memories? Does he have an issue with just the beauty of the physical world being gone? Is he like too enamored with the beauty of the physical world? Are there actually gods above these two gods? We're watching this thing, watching how these gods interact with each other, watching how these gods learn and fail, and just saying that this is all part of the process. It's pretty interesting stuff. If the biggest wrinkle in this entire thing really is the addition of the reincarnation system. And this brings us to good old Will. There is something very critical that Will ultimately does for the story, and that is specifically he has rhetoric against death. Now, the reason the rhetoric happens is because ultimately Stagnate represents death along with representing stagnation. You have ultimately Will talking about, hey, this is what I did in my past life. I didn't like this life. Will ultimately plays a interesting game where he sets a standard for what a good life lived is. He pretty much says that the way I lived my life before, that wasn't really living life. He's qualifying things, and he's ultimately bringing that experience that he has from his previous life in order to justify why it is that an immortal life could be an empty life. Now, mind you, again, the reason that happens is because Will himself needs a hard line against Stagnate. In the process, I think he slightly vilifies the version of immortality that Stagnate is offering, but thankfully, because Stagnate also brings in that stagnation aspect, I think it's perfectly legal. I think it makes sense. I would definitely say this is not the version of immortality that someone should be chasing after, so I think the writer did a really good thing there by at the very least giving us a version of immortality that we can largely disagree with. Had Stagnate not have these more gross qualities to his version of immortality, I would have been a lot more critical in this particular regard. Anyway, when it comes to Faraway Paladin, the interesting conflict comes in from the fact that reincarnation exists, and then the general aversion that people have to death and the aversion people have to immortal life. Pursuing immortality by itself would not be a negative thing, and it would not make sense to make it negative as according to the real world philosophies. That's why you have Stagnate having some more concerning undertones, such as an idea of a world that doesn't change. and Gracefield on the other end, representing the idea of things constantly being in motion. To make the situation work, the author ultimately had to do critical things, such as having Stagnate ignore the fact that the soul, for all that we see, seems to be immortal, and also having Stagnate be too emotionally compromised, taken away with the beauty of the world that he sees down below. The problems that these gods have would likely not be there if reincarnation had the final ultimate purpose of allowing souls to ascend to higher planes of existence, or if the gods were aware that is a possible end goal for reincarnation. This is a conflict that comes entirely out of weakness. Anyway guys, let me know what you thought down below. Thank you very much for watching. Very interesting stuff. And keep an eye out for any other videos. Now, just to give you a quick thing, I will be trying to do more videos like this because it's a bit more manageable for my schedule to do these special focused topics. Faraway Paladin does have a few more points of appreciation, but for other series that I'm watching that maybe don't have focused topics like Faraway Paladin, I will be doing roundup videos like every 5 episodes, every 4 episodes. It really depends on how much time I have on a week. So just keep your eye out, and I will be trying to produce more of these. Anyway, everyone, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, I hope you have an absolutely great day.